Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, we're talking about my Week 2 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. On today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. We'll talk about which defenses last week were giving up the most points to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format, talking about who has the most advantageous or perhaps the most disadvantageous matchup going into the week and how that can potentially affect their upside. After that, we'll talk about my top 36 wide receiver rankings, giving you guys my perspective and opinions and the statistics that justify my thought process going into the week and why I believe the wide receiver position currently stacks up as I'll have it. Now, before we begin today's video, I of course want to take some time to thank you guys for the incredible support. For those of you who have came out every single day smashing that like button and of course continuing the support with your viewership, I cannot thank you guys enough. Of course, you guys have been the backbone of this channel, helping us grow and almost getting us to 50,000 subscribers. So for those of you who have not yet already, make sure you join the community, click that subscribe button, because we're making fantasy football content for the entirety of the 2021 season. Whether it is these rankings videos, of course, we'll have the hidden gems, which some are going to miss, some are going to hit. That's just how it's going to work on a weekly basis. We'll of course have the matchup episode on the weekend. Of course, Sunday morning live streams, making sure that your lineups are ready before kickoff, the waiver wire episode, all of the above included with the channel. So if you haven't yet already, make sure you subscribe to the channel and also go down to the description below and check out my Discord, free to join for those of you guys who are interested. Also, while you're down there, we do have our Patreon link down there for those of you who are trying to get extra content. If you're trying to get all of your 2021 fantasy football questions answered by myself, you can join the Patreon and find other benefits included there. Also, while we're checking out the description of the video, there are timestamps down there. Today's video will be for half PPR. So again, if you're looking for a specific player, just click on them and it'll go ahead and skip you to that part. All right, let's get into talking about the wide receiver position, beginning with matchups. Let's go ahead and let's throw up the graphic on screen. So as of last week, I've gone ahead and I've compiled how many points defenses were giving up to opposing wide receivers in a half PPR scoring format. And what I found was that the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, of course, gave up the most points to opposing wide receivers, with Amari Cooper, CeeDee Lamb, Michael Gallup having incredible weeks this last Thursday. And then, of course, on the bottom of the list, the Philadelphia Eagles, who were quite honestly a surprise, only allowing a reception to one receiver, which was Calvin Ridley, amongst the entire group of wide receivers for the Atlanta Falcons. A very ridiculous statistic, something I haven't seen in quite some time. That being said, of course, there are other teams that are among the bottom of this list. For example, the Chargers, Los Angeles Rams, Saints. Specifically, the Rams are always going to be down there. Jalen Ramsey, that defense, they are locked and loaded. Of course, they're going to be one of the better secondaries in the league every single year, like they have been for the last couple seasons. Los Angeles Chargers being at the bottom there mainly has to do with the fact that, of course, Ryan Fitzpatrick left that game early, and of course, Taylor Heineke coming in. There wasn't much of a connection there with Terry McLaurin. Though he was able to make a couple plays here and there, it was very difficult for them to move the ball against the Los Angeles Chargers defense, which of course led to them losing. We of course have the Patriots. Once, in fact, Stephon Gilmore returns, that defense is going to get that much better this season. The New Orleans Saints, obviously, they haven't been one of the better secondaries in the league, but, you know, Aaron Rodgers was completely throwing the game literally to the other team. Of course, we have the Green Bay Packers. They themselves were able to lock down the wide receiver position, mainly because, again, you have Jair Alexander. You're good to go there. And majority of the points that were coming out of Jameis Winston's arm were going to a tight end by the name of Juwan Johnson. I know he's a hybrid on some formats in terms of he can be played as a wide receiver and or tight end, but typically he is a tight end through and through. But either way, of course, some of the better matchups: the Titans, Chicago Bears, Cincinnati Bengals, Washington Football Team, Dallas Cowboys, Houston Texans. We want to go after some of these teams. Some of them have better secondaries and just had bad weeks. We're going to have to adjust and talk about that throughout the rest of today's episode. But just wanted to go ahead and present to you guys exactly how secondaries and defenses did against the wide receiver position this past week. Now that we've gone ahead and covered that, we can move on to our top 36 wide receiver rankings for week 2 of the 2021 fantasy football season. Let's go ahead and begin with an obvious number 1, Davante Adams. He's going to have a vengeful week 2, as of course the Green Bay Packers were not able to produce in week 1. And a lot of people have been talking, are the Green Bay Packers washed? Is this offense going to be able to make the playoffs? Like, all of this noise that, again, people are over-exaggerating, overreacting, and that's just, you know, that's just the news in the outlets altogether. It is what it is. But this upcoming week against the Detroit Lions, it is one of the most advantageous matchups that you can possibly have in the entire fantasy landscape, based on the fact that, yes, the secondary already can't cover Davante Adams, but they also lost Jeff Okudah with an Achilles injury. Deebo Samuel this past week had 9 catches for 189 yards and a touchdown for 27.4 fantasy points and a half PPR. I can only imagine what Davante Adams is going to just deliver for us. Of course, I think he's probably going to see double the amount of targets he did this past week. He saw only 7 targets that led to 5 receptions and 56 yards against the Saints. That's probably going to double altogether. I mean, the last time he played against the Detroit Lions last season, 10 targets, 7 receptions, 115 yards and a touchdown, 21 fantasy points. Altogether, I think Davante Adams is going to have himself a great comeback week. Do not worry about it. We have Tyreek Hill as our number 2. I mean, Tyreek Hill was unbelievable. 37.3 fantasy points, 22 targets, leading to 14 receptions, 243 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. I mean, what kind of a performance was that? That is just unbelievable. I mean, I can't fathom how many targets he had. 22 is an unbelievable number. He pretty much garnered 42% of the entire passing attack from the Chiefs this past weekend. I mean, to be honest, playing against the Baltimore Ravens this upcoming week shouldn't really be an issue for him, considering if he is going to see anywhere even close to that double-digit targets range, he's going to continue to feast. I mean, he is one of the fastest wide receivers in the National Football League, and he's been able to deliver these kind of performances year over year without any hesitation. I mean, the last time he played against the Baltimore Ravens, he didn't have the greatest game, but ultimately still had 5 catches for 77 receiving yards and a receiving touchdown for 18.7 fantasy points last season. So as of right now, based on what the secondary of the Baltimore Ravens looked like when they played against the Raiders this past Monday night, I mean, the Raiders pretty much did whatever they wanted. Majority in that second half, of course. Bryan Edwards found himself a lot of success there. Hunter Renfrow, Zay Jones with a late touchdown, of course. But ultimately, I really do think that this offense is going to be able to just do what they want against the Baltimore Ravens, and that is why Tyreek Hill maintains a number 2 standing. DeAndre Hopkins is our number 3. So D-Hop, of course, coming off an incredible week in which he had 2 receiving touchdowns, along with 83 receiving yards on 6 receptions. A great overall game. Surprised he didn't see more targets, but this game got out of hand relatively quickly. This upcoming week, he plays against the Minnesota Vikings secondary. Again, the Vikings were... they were in trouble for majority of that game against the Cincinnati Bengals because Jamar Chase and T. Higgins were both able to tear apart Bashaud Breeland. Breeland, they just brought in to play cornerback for the Minnesota Vikings. They try to revamp their secondary. Of course, you have Patrick Peterson on one side, which none of these wide receivers even tested and or were going after. But Bashaud Breeland was specifically targeted and, of course, was scored on twice this past weekend. I think there's a very good opportunity for DeAndre Hopkins, who maintained about 25% of the target share in this offense, to have himself another big week. Again, coming off of a 23.3 point performance and a half PPR. It's without a doubt he's, of course, the number 1 target in this offense. And regardless of which cornerback he goes against, he's probably going to expose them. But if they can set him up for a couple good matchups against Breeland, he'll certainly find a lot of success this week and hopefully another touchdown. All right, Stefon Diggs, our thumbnail is number 4. Stefon Diggs is coming off a 14-target game in which he had 9 catches for 69 yards against the Pittsburgh Steelers defense. Pittsburgh has a good secondary, but again, there was a lot of shakiness and or inconsistency from the Buffalo Bills offense that I think after week 1 is potentially going to kind of work off the rust and going into this upcoming week's matchup against the Miami Dolphins. I mean, the last time we saw this team play against the Miami Dolphins was week 17 of last year. We didn't anticipate Josh Allen playing, but Josh Allen came out and put up 56 points against this defense, a little bit of Matt Barkley at the end of the game, but ultimately we're able to torch them. In the 2 contests that Stefon Diggs were able to play against the Miami Dolphins last season. In the first game, 8 catches, 153 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown. In the second game, which was week 17, which he left relatively early because, again, they had pretty much solidified their victory and they didn't have to play majority of the second half. 7 catches, 76 yards on 8 total targets. I know that the idea of Xavier Howard potentially covering Stefon Diggs can be worrisome, considering he's one of the better coverage corners in the National Football League, has led the league in terms of interceptions in the past 2 years combined. But I still think that Stefon Diggs, the amount of opportunity he gets from Josh Allen is going to solidify his value that much more. Even if it is in a half PPR or standard, he continues to see too many passes coming in his direction for him not to be an automatic play every single week. I think regardless of Xavier Howard, he's going to find a lot of success this week and pretty much get himself back on track to being, in this top 5 category. We have Calvin Ridley as our number 5. Again, Calvin Ridley had a very weird game this past weekend. Playing against the Philadelphia Eagles, which was a very advantageous matchup, only had 5 catches for 51 yards on 8 total targets. But like I mentioned earlier in the video, there wasn't a single other wide receiver for the Atlanta Falcons that caught a pass. I mean, that is just absolutely strange. It's bizarre, but going into this upcoming week's matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, of course, they gave up the most points to opposing wide receivers this past week with, of course, Dak Prescott torching them with Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. I think Calvin Ridley, of course, in the past has found a lot of success against this secondary, and I think that, his offensive line has not been able to protect Matt Ryan to give him the opportunity to get the ball out to Ridley. But ultimately, it's just going to be a matter of where the heck is this ball going to go other than Ridley. Of course, it's going to go in his direction. I expect him to see double-digit targets this week and get back on track. The last 2 times he played against the Tampa Bay secondary last season, 10 catches, 163 yards, and a touchdown for 26.6 fantasy points. 8 catches, 52 for 0 touchdowns, 8.6 fantasy points. Ultimately, I do believe Calvin Ridley gets back on track, has himself a big game here in week 2. Moving on to our number 6, we have Keenan Allen of the Los Angeles Chargers. Another great matchup is playing against the Dallas Cowboys secondary. Of course, they gave up a lot of points to Chris Godwin and Antonio Brown this past Thursday. And to be honest, when I think about what Keenan Allen is potentially going to be able to do, I mean, he's coming off of a week in which he had 13 targets, 9 receptions, and 100 receiving yards. Could have had the ability of scoring a receiving touchdown, but of course, his red zone target was blundered. Regardless, when I think about the secondary members of the Dallas Cowboys that are probably going to cover him, I expect Diggs to be covering Mike Williams for the majority of the week as Keenan Allen finds himself in the slot position a lot. So it's either going to be the number 2 cornerback or their slot cornerback, Jordan Lewis or Anthony Brown. Now, as of last week, Jordan Lewis gave up 5 catches for 69 yards and a touchdown, and Anthony Brown gave up 9 catches, 143 yards, and a touchdown. Keenan Allen is going to have a fantastic week, and since Justin Herbert took the starting quarterback position of the Los Angeles Chargers in week 2 of last season, with the games that they've played together where Keenan Allen has been fully healthy and has played the full contest, he's averaged 12.18 targets per game just in the 2020 contest. Of course, this last week, 13 targets, commanded 27.66% of the team's total targets. I think regardless of Eckler getting more opportunity and more targets in the passing game, it's not going to affect the overall upside of Keenan Allen this week. He is a fantastic play. We have Amari Cooper on the other side of this matchup playing for the Dallas Cowboys, and my goodness, Amari Cooper picked up exactly where he left off. We talked about it last week when I was talking about where I had him ranked. There was a potential that he could pick up exactly where he left off in 2020, and that's exactly what he did in week 1 of the 2021 season. Again, like I mentioned, in the first 4 weeks of the 2020 season with Dak Prescott, he was averaging 12 targets, 9 receptions, and 100 receiving yards per game, and about 16.65 fantasy points per game and a half PPR. He went ahead, put up 16 targets, 13 receptions, 139 and 2 touchdowns for 32.4 points. I mean, that kind of performance is unbelievable, specifically from an Amari Cooper-esque receiver. He's not like a Tyreek Hill that could take the top off of the defense and completely torch him. We don't really see this out of Amari Cooper, but maybe this offense has turned a new leaf and they're going to continue to feed him the ball at this level, which I hope is the possible case, because we want everyone to benefit in fantasy. Makes it that much more exciting. With Michael Gallup being out for the next couple weeks with an injury, I expect this team to, of course, funnel target Amari Cooper and CeeDee Lamb. Amari Cooper commanded 27.59% of the total target share in this offense. And yes, they were able to throw the ball a lot, 58 times, in fact, this past Thursday night. That's probably not going to be the case every single week, but it is a very exciting matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers. We could see a shootout as both of these defenses aren't the greatest, and we're going back and forth, throwing the ball and finding a lot of fantasy productivity. I think that'll be the case. Now, interestingly enough, we're going to go ahead and talk about another Dallas Cowboys wide receiver as our number 8. And to be honest, I think both of these guys are going to highly benefit from the fact that Michael Gallup is out, like I just mentioned with Amari Cooper. With Gallup out, we could even see CeeDee Lamb hop back into the slot position and, dominate a lot of mismatches. Again, Chris Harris Jr. is the slot cornerback when they're in their nickel packages for the Los Angeles Chargers. We know Chris Harris Jr. in the last couple years has been on the decline since leaving the Denver Broncos, but ultimately he's still a good cover slot corner. But in my opinion, regardless of the matchup on hand, I think CeeDee Lamb, him also garnering 15 targets. Of course, he had himself, 3 drop passes, still got himself 7 receptions, 104 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 19.9 fantasy points. If you can go ahead, clean up a couple of those drops, continue to get a steady load of targets going in your direction in the double-digit range, I absolutely believe that he is going to be able to dominate, because he is one of the deeper threats on this offense and can be utilized all across the field. They had him in the slot, out wide, in the backfield running routes. He is going to be the Swiss Army knife of this offense, and he's going to continue to prosper because of it. we have DK Metcalf as our number 9. Now, DK Metcalf was actually quite impressive this past week, considering the tougher matchup against the Indianapolis Colts secondary. I know they didn't have Xavier Howard this past week, but ultimately, we still had DK Metcalf dealing with a calf injury, was limited all week long, got to the Sunday morning matchup, and absolutely dominated against that secondary, had himself a good performance. Yeah, it wasn't the greatest. 14 points isn't something we're banging on the table about, but 4 catches on 5 targets, 60 receiving yards and a touchdown. We'll take it any day of the weekend. As of this month, we got a couple more games here for the Seattle Seahawks, and it's let Russ cook month. We got to remember that Russell Wilson in the month of September, as of late, has been a dominant force, minimum throwing 4 passing touchdowns as of the last 2 seasons. So as of this current moment in time, we go up against the matchup against the Tennessee Titans. This is going to be a very juicy one. In my opinion, I think the secondary, of course, they were giving up a lot of points last week to opposing wide receivers. We had DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Kirk, Rondale Moore, and AJ Green completely dominating that secondary, and it wasn't able to be stopped. I think Russell Wilson's going to cook, and of course, we're going to see DK Metcalf benefit from it this upcoming week. Hopefully, that target count from 5 can increase this upcoming week. But I think, of course, with the injury and, of course, his limited participation in practice kind of going away, DK Metcalf will be an even bigger part of this offense. We move on to our number 10. We have ourselves A.J. Brown, a former teammate in college of DK Metcalf and somebody that's playing against the Seattle Seahawks this upcoming week. I think the matchup is decent. I don't mind the matchup. I mean, we even saw Zach Pascal this past week score 2 receiving touchdowns against this Seattle Seahawks secondary. They can certainly be exposed, but the question is, which Tennessee Titans team are we going to see? Because regardless of what A.J. Brown did this last week, and he was fine, 12.9 fantasy points, had himself a receiving touchdown, 4 receptions, 49 yards on 8 total targets. He was fine. It wasn't the greatest week, but at least he was still able to produce in a game in which, in my opinion, was the worst Tennessee Titans output I've ever seen since Ryan Tannehill took the starting job. That's a total of 27 games that I've seen Ryan Tannehill as the starting quarterback of this team, and this was by far the worst. Now, of course, the offensive line played a lot of the issues here, being, of course, just lackluster. Taylor Lewan getting beat consistently across the board, and Chandler Jones just being able to dominate and impose his will. I mean, what did he have, 5 sacks this past week? I mean, that in itself is a huge difference maker, but this upcoming week, I think A.J. Brown, I think this offense is going to get back on track. They needed a little bit of a reality check, and regardless of what Tennessee Titans we honestly may see, I mean, we know that A.J. Brown is going to produce. I mean, this is a guy that has scored, I think, in the last 27 games for the Tennessee Titans, something like 17 or 18 total touchdowns, whether it is through the air or on the ground. That in itself, an incredible statistic, and I think A.J. Brown is going to continue to produce well. Moving on to our number 11, we have Justin Jefferson. And though he wasn't able to put up the greatest performance this last week, I still have a lot of confidence in him going into this Arizona Cardinals matchup. Last week, he had himself 9 targets that led to 5 receptions, 71 receiving yards, 0 touchdowns, but he was able to complete a pass, getting him over 10 fantasy points, exactly 10.04. Now, of course, that is underwhelming in comparison to what we've seen from Justin Jefferson last season, but I think he'll continue to just work and get back on track. Of course, the game script as a whole wasn't the greatest for the Minnesota Vikings. They were down, 21-3 early in that game. They had to make a comeback, and they were just trying to get the ball out of Kirk Cousins' hands as much as they could. And of course, they looked towards Adam Thielen, who is often running routes closer to the line of scrimmage, can get the ball out of Kirk Cousins' hands relatively quickly in comparison to feeding the ball down the field to Justin Jefferson. If the matchup can stay close enough, Justin Jefferson should be able to impose his will on the secondary, but we know that the Minnesota Vikings offensive line, they are very shaky, and that's going to force the ball out of Kirk Cousins' hand relatively quickly, which of course benefits Thielen in comparison to Jefferson. That all being said, Justin Jefferson's a must-play. Regardless of the matchup, I do believe that the secondary coverage isn't going to be a big deal. It's just a matter of whether Kirk Cousins has enough time in the pocket to let, of course, Justin Jefferson's routes develop and get him open and ready to score some points. We move on to Chris Godwin as our number 12. You may have been wondering which one of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers wide receivers we're going to come up first on today's video, and that's going to be Chris Godwin, specifically because I value volume of targets at the wide receiver position more than just about any other statistic. Of course, if you're scoring consistent touchdowns, that is definitely going to be something to keep an eye on, but the volume of targets leads me to believe that, yes, the quarterback is looking in that direction. He's consistently getting open, and that is going to lead to his ultimate success week in and week out. Playing against the Atlanta Falcons should be relatively easy. Of course, we saw DeVonta Smith, Jalen Reagor, Dallas Goedert. I mean, anybody was able to score against this secondary this past week. And of course, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, defending champs, coming off a week in which they were able to put up a lot of points in the passing game, will be able to impose their will on this defense. Again, of the amount of times that Tom Brady threw the ball, Chris Godwin commanded 28% of the total target share, which is incredible. The last 2 times he's played against the Atlanta Falcons defense, specifically last season, 4 catches, 36 yards, and a touchdown. 5 catches, 133 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He's had great performances in back-to-back contests against this secondary. Again, a lot of it looks very similar than in years past, so we're not worried about some of the different substitutions they've made because their secondary as a whole is still one of the worst in the National Football League in terms of personnel and in terms of experience. They are relatively young. Ultimately, I think Chris Godwin's a fantastic play. As long as the targets are going in his direction, he's going to find a lot of success. Our number 13 for this week in the beginning of our wide receiver twos is Cooper Kupp. Cooper Kupp, I mean, my goodness, was he an incredible play this past week against the Chicago Bears. We know the Chicago Bears secondary wasn't going to be great, but regardless of the fact that they had lost a lot of members in the secondary, Cooper Kupp underneath was able to get himself, 10 targets for 7 receptions, 112 receiving yards and a touchdown, had himself a huge 50-yard receiving touchdown on a blown coverage, and even later in the game, Cooper Kupp was able to get himself a slant route that he takes all the way to the 1-yard line. Unfortunately, is cut short. Darrell Henderson comes in, rushes a touchdown in. Obviously, another touchdown could have been on Cooper Kupp's resume, but as of this current moment in time, when I think about the Rams offense, we know Matthew Stafford's a gunslinger. We know he's going to air it out, and they've got a lot of receiving options that will benefit from that, whether it is Robert Woods, Tutu Atwell, Van Jefferson, of course, had himself a receiving touchdown, Deshaun Jackson, but underneath, the 2 safety blankets of this offense are Cooper Kupp and Tyler Higbee. And there's a reason why Cooper Kupp managed to get 38.46% of the target share going in his direction. That's a lot of work for him, and I think as the weeks go on, from what we've heard, I mean, it seems that Cooper Kupp is the number 1 in this team in terms of relationship with Matthew Stafford, and based on their performance this past week, should continue as such. Based on what we saw Tyler Lockett do against this secondary in Indianapolis, I think Cooper Kupp will slide right in and have himself a great week here. Moving on to number 14, we have ourselves Antonio Brown. And I contemplated a lot where I was going to put Antonio Brown this week. And I considered putting him in the number 12 spot instead of Godwin because, of course, we saw an incredible performance out of Antonio Brown this past Thursday. 7 targets, 5 receptions, 121 yards, and a touchdown. That looked like the Antonio Brown of the Pittsburgh Steelers. The one that was a top 4 wide receiver for 6 consecutive seasons, like just putting up fantasy points galore. With 21.2 fantasy points, I thought to myself, you got to put some respect on this man's name. And he plays against the matchup that, in my opinion, is his matchup. Last year, after joining the team in Week 9, of course, they played that very lackluster game against the New Orleans Saints. But from the rest of the season beyond, of course, he was a consistent producer in this offense. But in the 2 games that he played against the Atlanta Falcons, 5 catches, 93 yards, and a touchdown for 17.8 fantasy points. And 11 catches, 138 yards, and 2 touchdowns for 31.3 fantasy points. I think Antonio Brown, yes, didn't have the greatest target percentages last week in comparison to guys like Chris Godwin, Gronk. But to be honest, if he's going to be utilized as such against the secondary like the Atlanta Falcons that is just all over the place, they cannot cover the wide receiver position, I absolutely do believe that Antonio Brown is a must start. I know that many of you who have Antonio Brown and didn't start in this last week, you already know you're going to put him in the lineup. You don't need me to tell you, but either way, just want to give you some more confidence because he's been able to perform against them and he's coming off a great performance. And like Bruce Arians said, he looks a lot like the Antonio Brown of old, which many of us have missed. Number 15 is Tyler Lockett. Like I mentioned when I talked about Cooper Kupp, Tyler Lockett had a great performance against the Indianapolis Colts. Absolutely dominated that secondary with 4 catches, 100 receiving yards, and 2 receiving touchdowns. Had 2 deep ball passes that led to touchdowns. Was able to just take the top off the defense and burn with his speed. Now the question is, can he do the same this upcoming week against the Tennessee Titans? And the answer is absolutely yes. It's not even close. The secondary is not great. They performed very badly this past week against DeAndre Hopkins, Christian Kirk, Rondale Moore, AJ Green. They were not able to stop Kyler Murray in anything that they posed against them. This upcoming week, I think Russ is going to cook once again. And in the last 4 September games that Russell Wilson has played, he's thrown a minimum of 4 passing touchdowns in each of them. Going into this week, I know Russell Wilson didn't pass the ball a lot. In fact, On the 5 total targets that Tyler Lockett had, he did garner 21.74% of the target share, but that's because Russell Wilson only threw the ball 23 times. It's a very ridiculous number. Imagine if Russell Wilson throws the ball even more, how much more success we might find in a potential shootout this upcoming week. Tyler Lockett's a great play. Moving on to our number 16, we have Adam Thielen coming off of an incredible game, 2 touchdowns, 9 catches, 92 yards, had himself a red zone target, a nice little quick out route towards the pylon, scored a touchdown. Then later in the game, as they were, pretty much vying back into the game, trying to get as many points on the board to force it into overtime, which they were successfully able to do, Adam Thielen on a quick slant route takes it 30 yards to the end zone against a very bad Cincinnati Bengals secondary. This upcoming week plays against the Arizona Cardinals. Like I mentioned with Justin Jefferson, this is going to be a very tough game, in my opinion, for the Minnesota Vikings offensive line and specifically Kirk Cousins. But this does not hurt Adam Thielen. In fact, helps him because, again, we know that he has incredible upside, especially down in the red zone and his playmaking ability. But if Kirk Cousins has to get the ball out of his hand quickly in order to avoid the potential of a Chandler Jones, J.J. Watt getting after him, then, of course, the ball is going to get thrown to a shorter end target. They don't really have that much of a presence at the tight end position. Of course, Irv Smith could return in the coming weeks, but until then, it's going to be Adam Thielen short. It's going to continue to be checking it down to him in these shorter routes against linebackers that truly can't cover. So as of this moment in time, I have a lot of confidence in Adam Thielen. Last week, the Tennessee Titans' leading receiver was Chester Rogers in terms of yardage. He was playing in the slot and benefited the most because, again, Tannehill had to get the ball out of his hands quickly. I think Adam Thielen, of course, has the incredible upside of getting double-digit targets and, of course, delivering on it regardless of the matchup. Should be a great play as our number 16. Number 17 is Allen Robinson. And the reason why I didn't like Allen Robinson that much last week, and I had him at the number 24 spot, was because he played against Jalen Ramsey. And we know what happens, guys. I know Jalen Ramsey at times will go and cover a different receiver, but the way that they used him on Sunday Night Football against Allen Robinson just did not pose any potential for upside in that game. Andy Dalton didn't look great. There were a lot of turnovers, and the offense was in shambles very quickly. But with that being said, Adam Thielen was able to still garner 11 targets, which we love to see, which is 27.5% of the total target share in this respective offense. We get Andy Dalton playing against his former team, the Cincinnati Bengals, this upcoming week. I think there is a very good chance the Chicago Bears are going to funnel target Allen Robinson, send the ball in his direction as much as possible. Of course, we saw Justin Jefferson, Adam Thielen, and even KJ Osborne finding a lot of success against this secondary. I think it'll be very easy for, of course, Allen Robinson to get himself in that double-digit target range once again and find some, himself in the positive side of the fantasy category in terms of the wide receiver 2 section. In comparison to where I think he had 6.5 fantasy points this last week. Obviously underwhelming, but the matchup definitely plays a big difference. We have Diontae Johnson as our number 18. Again, Diontae Johnson, another game with Ben Roethlisberger in which he finds himself with double-digit targets. In fact, he had 10 total targets that led to 5 receptions, 36 total receiving yards, and a touchdown against a very tough Buffalo Bills secondary, but regardless of that, was able to garner 31.25% of the team's total target share. And when I think about their matchup this upcoming week, of course, we know that Diontae Johnson doesn't get those targets because willy-nilly. No, he gets open on a consistent basis. In fact, the beginning of the Steelers game, the first 3 passing attempts from Ben Roethlisberger were all 3 to Diontae Johnson, was able to continue to look for him, and that's going to continue to be their entire offensive scheme in terms of passing the ball. Of course, you've got Claypool and Juju Smith, but Diontae Johnson is the number 1 in this offense, and there's no debating that. Playing against Las Vegas this week is going to be a far more significantly easier matchup in comparison to having the matchup against a Tre'Davious White. I think the fact that we saw Marquise Brown and Sammy Watkins both find success when, of course, Lamar Jackson was struggling to throw the ball. I think Diontae Johnson, Ben Roethlisberger, and this Pittsburgh Steelers offense that is going to potentially spread it out and, of course, continue to throw the ball consistently, he's going to find a lot of success this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 19, we have Deebo Samuel of the San Francisco 49ers. As of this current moment in time, he is by far and away the number 1 overall wide receiver. In fact, in comparison to all teams this last week, garnered the highest target share of just total overall percentages from his respective team. Had himself 12 targets, and you may be thinking, it's not a lot. There was a lot of people that out-targeted him. But when we talk about 26 total passing attempts in his respective offense, 12 is a lot. That's 46%. And to be honest, it's potentially going to be the same this upcoming week. They do play against the Philadelphia Eagles. They did, render everyone in that receiving core, even Calvin Ridley, relatively worthless this past week. But I personally think coming off a performance in which you have 9 catches for 189 and a touchdown isn't generally a fluke. Considering, again, there's not really many people competing for targets in this offense. I know George Kittle's definitely going to get his, but outside of that, there isn't a guarantee for any other receivers, considering earlier today, Kyle Shanahan did say that if Brandon Ayuk wants to play more, then he has to be better than the guys playing behind him, which of course he's referring to Sherfield getting more and more reps and opportunities in the offense. So as it currently stands, Brandon Ayuk's probably going to be a definite sit for this week until we end up seeing what happens. And Deebo Samuel against the Philadelphia secondary that, in my opinion, is just very close to being exposed this week, should be a fantastic matchup in play. Terry McLaurin's our number 20. I don't have a problem with Terry McLaurin. I have a problem with Terry McLaurin's quarterbacks. They can't, for some reason, find a great quarterback to stay healthy for the Washington football team since Terry McLaurin has been there. And to be honest, it is unfortunate, but we're just going to have to deal with it. Taylor Heineke's going to be the starting quarterback, and though he may not be the greatest, we're going to have to hope that the targets are going in the direction of a Terry McLaurin. But last week, wasn't able to find much success. 4 catches on 4 targets, 62 yards, 8.2 fantasy points. That's my concern. I'm worried about that kind of performance this upcoming week, as they're on a shorter week. It's a Thursday night football game against the New York Giants. We know James Bradbury is their number 1 overall cornerback, probably going to be shadowing Terry McLaurin for the entire game. And when I think about, okay, Terry McLaurin, tougher matchup, bad quarterback, I still think that there is room for potential upside. Because when I look at the last 2 contests that he's played against the New York Giants, regardless of who was at quarterback, was able to find himself 7 catches in both games. But in one game, 7 catches for 74 yards, and the other 7 catches for 115 yards and a touchdown. He does have upside, has potential. It's just tough. Short week, inconsistent quarterback. Let's hope he gets the targets that he relatively needs in order to sustain his fantasy productivity this week. Number 21 is DJ Moore of the Carolina Panthers. Though DJ Moore wasn't able to take the top off the defense and have, the blow-up touchdown game that would get him in the, top 15 category in terms of total wide receiver points, 12.4 fantasy points isn't the worst. We'll take that. 6 receptions, 80 yards. This upcoming week plays against the New Orleans Saints. And we know the New Orleans Saints, they definitely destroyed the Green Bay Packers this past week. But in my opinion, when we look at this offense, 8 targets is probably going to increase for DJ Moore going into this upcoming week, mainly because the New Orleans Saints are going to force them to throw the ball that much more. Like I mentioned yesterday, Christian McCaffrey in the last 2 games that he's played against this New Orleans Saints defense has averaged about 2.9 yards per carry in both games. So if, in fact, we're getting into a contest in which Sam Darnold's going to have to throw the ball, he's going to look to his favorite wide receivers, which, of course, are going to be Christian McCaffrey out of the backfield, then DJ Moore, trying to make himself some plays in the secondary. The last couple times that DJ Moore has played against his secondary, luckily for him, has found a lot of success, which gives me confidence in sending him out there. Of course, 5 catches for 101 yards and 4 catches for 93 yards and 2 touchdowns. I think that New Orleans secondary, in comparison to the rest of their defense, is their biggest weakness, but it's all a matter of whether or not Sam Darnold's going to be able to deliver the rock down the field and move the ball enough to where DJ Moore is finding himself in that red zone threat category and potentially scoring this upcoming week. Moving on to our number 22, we have Mike Evans. Now, though many of you may be considering or thinking, Andrew, why is Mike Evans so low in comparison to an Antonio Brown and or Chris Godwin? Of course, week 1's matchup doesn't give me all the confidence in the world, but I still think he is, certainly going to be a top 24 wide receiver, mainly because the matchup is extremely advantageous. The last 2 times that he's played against the Atlanta Falcons last season, in the first game, 6 catches, 110 yards, 14 fantasy points. Second game, 3 catches, 46 yards, 7.1 fantasy points. The last week, of course, against the Dallas Cowboys, was covered by Diggs. Wasn't able to find much success. Only 6 targets, leading to 3 receptions and 24 receiving yards. And with Gronkowski being such a big factor in the game, and of course, Chris Godwin, 14 targets, Antonio Brown, 7 targets, and them not relatively running the ball that much, it leads me to believe that there's a potential in which Mike Evans, yes, has himself a decent game. Maybe he goes for 3 catches and 100 yards. That's still going to be a 10-point play in a half PPR. And unfortunately, that in itself gives me a little bit of worry, because if he's not able to have that extremely high upside game, especially in a matchup which they're not going to have to throw the ball for any of the second half, I think this is probably going to be a game in which they're running the clock out for a majority of that fourth quarter, as they'll have maintained a lead and the Falcons are trying to come back but aren't able to mount one because of how good this defense is, specifically up front and pressuring Matt Ryan. So I think Mike Evans still is going to be a good overall option, but the upside needs to once again kind of be reproven to me, even though he doesn't have to. At this moment, I don't want to see the 2019 season reappear. If you guys remember with Jameis Winston in the beginning of the season, he put together like 4 or 5 consecutive performances of single-digit points, which scared many of us because that's just what he is. He is a very much so touchdown-dependent receiving option, and if it's not there, we're in trouble. We move on to Jamar Chase as our number 23. Jamar Chase had himself a fantastic week. 5 catches, 101 yards, a receiving touchdown. I don't know if you guys have seen the clip. I saw it on Twitter earlier this week of the side-by-side of the LSU play in the national championship against Clemson and this past week's play against, of course, the Minnesota Vikings. An identical play, just chalked up and executed identically. Unbelievable how, just seamlessly that they were able to produce it just a couple years apart from one another. Regardless, Jamar Chase this upcoming week in a very advantageous matchup against Chicago. Of course, we just saw the Chicago Bears defense get torched by Matthew Stafford and that Rams receiving corps. As of this current moment in time, I think Jamar Chase, garnering almost 26% of the total offensive target share is fantastic. Putting up an 18-point fantasy week after all the speculation as to whether or not he could catch the ball or not, whether he has the yips, was able to at least silence many of us. And I'm glad to say I'm all in on the Jamar Chase train. Let's put him at 23 and fire him up this week in a good matchup. Now, on the other side of this offensive formation, we have his teammate, T. Higgins, who he himself had himself a great week. 4 catches, 58 yards, and a receiving touchdown, 13.8 half PPR fantasy points. In my opinion, of course, not seeing as many targets as a Jamar Chase was a little disappointing because I really do believe that T. Higgins could very easily still be the number 1 wide receiver option of this offense. And it's just going to be a matter of whether or not who gets that touchdown on a weekly basis. Because if, in fact, T. Higgins is the guy that scores this week and Jamar Chase isn't, that is definitely going to be the other side of the coin that potentially we're going to have to figure out who's going to be the one in that given week. The matchup is such an advantageous one this week with, of course, Chicago's secondary being in shambles that I think T. Higgins, an automatic play and a top 24 play at that. We move on to our number 25. We have Robert Woods. I love Robert Woods. You guys know that. But having only, 3 receptions, 27 yards, and a touchdown on 4 total targets is relatively concerning. That being said, Robert Woods typically does this. He'll put up 10 plus points, maybe 3 weeks in a row, and then he'll have his 24-point game. Then he'll go back to the 2 games of 14 and 12, and then have an 18-point game. He's like that. He is consistent. That I can give him. He's a very consistent wide receiver option. But as of this upcoming week, doesn't have the worst matchup in the world playing against Indianapolis, but they are a good secondary. I think if Robert Woods doesn't score that touchdown this past weekend, unfortunately, the guy's a 4-point play. And that in itself is going to be a problem in the coming weeks if we're going to end up seeing that. Hopefully we'll see more target share go in his direction. And because of the fact that he is one of the deeper threats in this offense, and they are running similar routes down the field, and they're trying to set up plays for a Tutu Atwell or Deshaun Jackson for the deep ball, it could potentially take away from the overall upside of Robert Woods, especially in this matchup if, in fact, Xavier Rhodes returns. But as of right now, still have confidence in him as a wide receiver 3 option this upcoming week. Julio Jones is my number 26. To be honest, I think Julio Jones has a lot of upside. As of all the players that I'm going to mention on this screen, at the wide receiver 3 section, he probably has the highest upside of being a top 10 wide receiver this week. But the unfortunate nature of this offense is that as of this last week, they had the worst performance in a while. Ryan Tannehill and him did not look good together. The targets were just, okay. Not the greatest. Of course, they weren't really airing it out. They didn't have much time. But against Seattle, we could find some success. The last time Julio played against Seattle was last season. In that contest, he had 9 catches for $157, 20.2 fantasy points. Why not again? Allow Julio to just completely dominate the secondary and pepper him with targets, please. Like I'm sure we all know, Julio Jones is a top 12 wide receiver, right? But he needs to be given the opportunity to prove it once again, to give us the confidence that, yes, we made the right decision and Julio's back, baby. I think this week will be the week in which he does so against Seattle. Just got to get him more targets. Moving on to Mike Williams at number 27. Speaking of targets, Mike Williams had 12 targets for 8 receptions, 82 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 18.2 fantasy points. In terms of all wide receivers in the National Football League last week, he tied for the 8th most total targets, had 25.53% of the total target share of his respective offense. This upcoming week, playing against the Dallas Cowboys secondary, if in fact, somehow, some way, one of these other cornerbacks are on him, whether it is a Jordan Lewis or an Anthony Brown, he's going to score. But if it is Diggs, similar to the way that we saw, of course, Mike Evans struggle in week 1, we could see a little bit of a reduction of overall upside from Mike Williams. But as long as Justin Herbert is looking in his direction and he's getting himself open, he should be fine. I think it's a fantastic play this upcoming week with upside against a very poor secondary. Corey Davis is our number 28, and though he is in a tough matchup against Bill Belichick in this New England Patriots defense, the wide receiver corps for the Miami Dolphins were able to find success. I mean, I think Devontae Parker, what did he have? 4 catches for 80-plus yards. That's great. We'll take that. Jalen Waddle was able to find himself, a receiving touchdown and 60-plus receiving yards. We'll take that. But in comparison to the offense of what exactly the New York Jets are going to be producing, I think it's going to be tough. Bill Belichick, since the year 2000 against rookie quarterbacks, has a record of 21-6. That is very scary for Zach Wilson. But hopefully, like I anticipate, when Zach Wilson, of course, is getting pressured and is trying to figure out where to go with the ball, he's going to go to his safety blanket like he did this last week, and he's going to go to Corey Davis and find success there. Chase Claypool is our number 29. Chase Claypool was not on these rankings last week and finally makes his presence known, because though he's coming off a performance in which he had 3 receptions for 45 yards on 5 targets, not the greatest week in the world, I still think that Chase Claypool is an inconsistent wide receiver, but is very likely to score a touchdown this week based on the matchup alone. The Las Vegas Raiders are not the greatest secondary, whether it is going to be Trayvon Mullen or Casey Hayward. I truly do believe that Chase Claypool can find the end zone this week, as they're going to be airing it out a lot against that defense and potentially scoring a lot, whether it is on the ground or through the air. I think Chase Claypool is a big part of this offense. Of course, the inconsistency and the dependency of touchdowns is what, of course, gets him off this list at times and leaves him in the back end of the wide receiver 3 conversation. But regardless of that, I have confidence in him this upcoming week. DeVonta Smith. DeVonta Smith plays against the San Francisco 49ers, and as of this moment in time, I don't even think this is that bad of a matchup. With Jason Verrett tearing his ACL this past week, Emmanuel Mosley not even playing this last week, the secondary is already banged up for the San Francisco 49ers. And if Jalen Hurts is able to sit in the pocket comfortably against a pass rush, which of course he's going to see Arik Armstead and Bosa trying to get after him, if he can sit in the pocket steadily and maybe even scramble outside of it, but find DeVonta Smith as many times as he was able to last week, 8 targets, 6 receptions for 71 yards and a touchdown, I think we could see a lot of success. Obviously, in comparison to last week's matchup, it's not going to be as easy, but I still think there's a lot of talent and a lot of upside with a young receiver like DeVonta Smith. Jarvis Landry is our number 31. Luckily for many of us, Jarvis Landry was able to score that rushing touchdown, because if he was called short, his 16.9 point fantasy weeks, obviously goes back to being a subpar performance under 10 points, but luckily was able to find that. This upcoming week, Kevin Stefanski has already confirmed that Odell Beckham Jr. is going to be out. They're playing against the Houston Texans. This is an incredible matchup coming off a week in which he had 5 targets, 5 receptions, 71 receiving yards. When we go ahead and isolate and look at just what exactly the Jags wide receivers did against this secondary, Marvin Jones Jr. had himself a touchdown. Chark had himself 3 receptions on 12 targets, dropped 2 passes, but of course, still scored a touchdown. Those are 2 16-point fantasy wide receivers. And even, Laviska Shenault was able to at least get some points, regardless of how they were using him, not giving him that much opportunity, but hopefully we'll expand more. But regardless, the whole point is Jarvis Landry. He's the leading receiving option in this offense. They're going to do whatever they want against that defense. Houston's going to be in trouble, and Jarvis Landry is going to benefit from it. Robby Anderson's our number 32. Now, even though Robby Anderson's coming off a week in which he literally only had 1 catch for 57 yards and a touchdown against his former team, the New York Jets, I still think that Robby Anderson has a lot of potential this upcoming week against the New Orleans Saints. I mean, the New Orleans Saints are going to force the Carolina Panthers to pass the ball, maybe the entire game. Again, like I mentioned in regards to when I talked about Christian McCaffrey yesterday and DJ Moore prior in this episode, Christian McCaffrey has not really succeeded that much on the ground against this team. The ability to run the ball 20-plus times is probably not going to be a viable option. They're going to pass for a majority of the game and trying to keep up with whatever Jameis Winston is going to be able to produce with Alvin Kamara in that offense. So as of right now, I think there is a very good chance that we see a high upside game, more targets certainly, and more receptions going in the direction of Robby Anderson. Last season when he played against the New Orleans Saints, had a performance of 6 catches, 74 yards. I believe we can get an even better performance out of him this upcoming season with more comfort in the offense. We move on to Courtland Sutton as our number 33. He plays against the Jaguars, guys. That's all I literally have to say. I know he had a horrible week in week 1. And the stats, I don't even want to mention them because they're so bad. But again, we have to remember he's coming back from an ACL injury. He's trying to recalibrate. They don't have Jerry Jeudy now. And they're going to be able to score at will. Because unless the Jaguars are somehow, some way going to completely, change this thing around. I'm already hearing that Urban Meyer is going to leave after 1 year. That organization is already in trouble. I think Courtland Sutton certainly find himself a lot of success this week with Teddy Bridgewater as the number 1 wide receiver option of this Denver Broncos offense. Moving on to our next wide receiver, number 34, Brandin Cooks. Cooks plays against the Cleveland Browns, and obviously watching and seeing what Tyreek Hill was able to do against that defense, having 36 fantasy points, 22 targets, 14 receptions, 200, it doesn't matter. The whole point is, what are we going to expect to see from Brandin Cooks? Can he put up similar numbers? Can Tyrod Taylor be as effective as he was last week against the Jaguars, this week against the Cleveland Browns? I don't think that'll be the case, but regardless, he is the number 1 receiving option in this offense. The defense will probably be double covering him for the entire game because they know there's only one place to go with the ball to find a lot of success and to really gash your defense. So go ahead, force Tyrod Taylor to make decisions, to look away from his first read of Brandin Cooks and make him win the game. Not force Brandin Cooks to catch the ball once for 75 yards and put you in a bad spot. So I think Brandin Cooks will be limited in comparison to last week, but still find success. The penultimate options for this week, our number 35, is going to be Jakobi Meyers. Now, I considered the potential of putting Nelson Aguilar here, but based on the fact that Jakobi Meyers has found success in the past against the New York Jets, and of course, had the most targets amongst all receiving options for this team this last week, of course, garnering 21.21% of the target share. I think that Jakobi Meyers is in a good spot. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 44 yards this last week for 7.4 fantasy points. Isn't the greatest, but definitely had a tough matchup against that secondary in Miami. But the New York Jets secondary, they're not great. And I anticipate Jakobi Meyers to do something similar to what he did last season. In the 2 contests that he played, the first one, 12 catches for 169 yards. Great game. And in the second game, 6 catches, 68 yards, and had a passing touchdown. I think there's a very good chance that Jakobi Meyers scores this week, finds himself a lot of success in fantasy. The last option I wanted to mention is Sterling Shepard for the Thursday night game. Sterling Shepard, in my opinion, is probably going to get a lot of overall opportunity. Like I mentioned in this week's waiver wire episode, since coming back from the injured reserve in week 7 of the 2020 season, he's averaged about 8 targets per game with Daniel Jones under center. Of course, this last week, 9 targets, 7 receptions, 113 receiving yards, and a receiving touchdown for 20.8 fantasy points, 24.32% of the team's total target share. That's great. Those are incredible numbers. You play against the Washington football team, not the easiest matchup in the world, and certainly didn't produce well against them last year. In the game that he played against them, 8 targets, 6 receptions, 39 yards. But if anybody in this offense is going to be able to have a huge game, in my opinion, with how bad Daniel Jones has been, because his offensive line has been, of course, falling apart every single year, a fantastic pass rush getting after them. Of course, the defense is going to have to carry with, of course, Ryan Fitzpatrick going down. I think there's a very good chance that Daniel Jones is just going to try to get the ball out of his hands as quickly as possible. With Saquon not being full go, Evan Ingram still not back, the ball is going to go in Sterling Shepard's direction, and that is why I have him as my number 36. I want to thank everybody for watching today's episode. That concludes my Week 2 wide receiver rankings for the 2021 fantasy football season. Thank you, everybody. Once again, if you haven't yet already, smash the like button down below. Let me know in the comment section what you guys think about today's rankings. Who am I missing on this list that has the potential as, of course, being a top 36 wide receiver this week? There's a lot of them. There's a lot of wide receiver options I didn't mention. All the Jaguars guys this week could end up doing it. You never know. But regardless, thank you, everybody, for watching. If you haven't yet already, check out my Patreon down below if you're trying to find extra rankings, all of your 2021 fantasy football questions answered, and all of the extra content provided there. Thank you once again, and until tomorrow, we'll of course be talking about quarterbacks and tight ends. I'll see you guys. Peace.